Hi, everyone. My name's Kim Kronk. I'm Millcraft's marketing manager. We're excited that you're here and appreciate your time. We know that there's a lot of things you could be doing today, and we're really happy that you chose to spend your time with us. So today we're honored to introduce Greg Lovensheimer, our president at Millcraft. Greg brings over 40 years of experience in the paper, print, and graphic communications industry, having begun his career at Mead Paper. His extensive background spans the entire spectrum of manufacturing and distribution processes, from starting as an operator to roles such as supervisor, trainer, capital project manager, Lean Six Sigma Green Belt, product manager, director of operations, chief operating officer, and now our esteemed president. In addition to his role at Millcraft, Greg serves as the board member of Two Sides and is a very recent past chairman of the board for the National Paper Trade Association. His wealth of knowledge and leadership have been instrumental in shaping our company and our industry. We're excited to share valuable industry news and insights with you today, and we appreciate you taking the time to join us. Thank you all for being here, and please welcome Greg Lovensheimer.
Thanks, Kim. I appreciate it. We have almost 300 registered attendees for the call, which is awesome. And then we tend to get a couple hundred more that watch us on YouTube. So we sincerely appreciate you all joining in. And part of this is just trying to make sure that we create an opportunity to engage with the industry, right? Because if I go back and think about how this all started back in 2017, is that we were seeing and reading the tea leaves and realizing there were things that were occurring that folks just really weren't talking about on a bigger stage. And so whenever there's an opportunity, you got to say, who should fill that gap, and, why not us? And so appreciate all the support that you guys have all given. Again, my job here, like I always like to start, is to be apolitical, right? I'm not red, I'm not blue. I try to be as black and white as possible, right? And my job is never to invoke fear, but to provide you some information that hopefully you find insightful and maybe educate you so that you're better prepared to navigate what lies ahead, right? So let's start with something that's not controversial. Start of the new year, the Pantone Color of the Year Cloud Dancer, right? Gotta love this one, right? Especially given I think last year's was like a mocha color. The soft billowy white that symbolizes a calming influence on society. And boy, don't we need that these days, right? And don't we all just want a little, clouds in our life these days? The reality is that's probably not that case, especially given what's occurred here over the last several weeks and what a difference a few weeks makes. As we were preparing to put this presentation together, we were talking about, and as you started looking through the data, you could see and make the argument that the industry, the graphics paper industry, was turning the corner, preparing to turn that corner, reaching that point of positive change or improvement after a period of difficulty and adversity. And you could really start to see it in the numbers I'll share in a little bit. You could see it in the data. You could absolutely see it in the data. Unfortunately, even though we were seeing positive results and quoting activities was good, and people were starting to see a correlation of quotes to outcomes, which is always a good thing. And the reality is that optimism is really not shared by all, right? And there's still segments of our industry that are continue to underperform, and that uncertainty still exists, right? Whether that's due to tariffs or supply chain shortages, and now throw in a little bit of March Madness, right? I'm not necessarily talking about the basketball game, right? The basketball tournament, so to speak. And so, first of all, we appreciate the fact that you're joining us. We know that there are other options. You could be watching the first round of the men's NCAA Division I basketball tournament. You're choosing to spend time with us, so we're grateful for that. But there's other March Madness that's kind of going on that we'll talk about. If I think about the agenda, try to keep our agenda, pretty straightforward so that folks know what to expect when we get together. We always like to, call ourselves accountable. What did we talk about last time? What did we think was going to happen versus what's really starting to happen? Really talk about what's changed since that fourth quarter, and then talk about, are there anything that's new that's going on with macro forces in the print space, in the paper space, and then what do we see looking forward? Last time when we were together, we talked about this short-term choppy waters. And we talked about the fact that everything looked like it was turning towards growth, right? You could see some of the early indicators really being out there. There was, quoting activity that was picking up. The uncertainty from the tariffs was starting to wane. At least people knew how to react to the tariffs that were in place. And we were talking about, what is the catalyst for this calm seas ahead? And we talked about there were a lot of different forces at play, right? That you normally look in an industry and you talk about Porter's 5 forces. And we talked about, man, there were so many other things that were outside these 5 forces, whether that's, the bans on carbon black, labor laws, state sales tax laws, EUDR, which, now is in the rearview mirror, tariffs. I won't get to EPR, but I would love to engage in a dialogue. If you want to talk about extended producer responsibility, man, that's a webinar in and of itself in terms of the potential risk to our industry, and more importantly, the good fight that folks like Ed Allen and the folks at WCP out on the West Coast and NAW, the National Association of Wholesale Distributors, are engaging in. Trying to fight some of these, a lot of these state one-off laws with EPR, but again, for a different time. And we talked about there was a lot of uncertainty, but the fact that, as tariff rates were at least being locked in, there was some pathway to improvement, and you could really, really start to see that. And as we start with quotes just from those that we talk about, and these 2 quotes actually come from suppliers in the industry. And the first one was from the coated board space, talked about the overall market. They were really seeing it as strong. They were seeing increased activity related election related printing, and that some of the demand may in fact be because there were other suppliers that were struggling right now. On the coated paper side, one of them had mentioned that January was very weak for them. February had improved, and March was shaping up to be even better. And then as they started to look at the order rates for April and May, they were strong and appeared to be comparable to July, October levels. And boy, wouldn't we all like to see that, right? And really, as you all registered, our team always asks, what do you expect the future to be, right? What do you expect 2026 to be? And so this is your data, not mine. Then that 62% of you, as you registered, said we expect business to be better in 2026 than in 2025. 32% said about the same, and only 5% worse. And that's the one that's the real driver here, is that only 5% saw any kind of pessimism, that everybody else was at least at parity, if not optimism. And that's a wonderful sight to see. But again, there are a lot of things that have kind of changed since we all started talking about this webinar. But some of the key concepts, that a print growth demand was noted. There were obviously some economic uncertainty. There was always tariff threats that were out there, and some of the quotes that you all shared was, hey, there's this worldwide uncertainty. Tariffs are affecting supply chains, and there's geopolitical issues. Hey, the post office is holding us back, right? Finding good people. It's, the current workforce is aging out. Uncoated free sheet market tightness. This uncertainty, not sure how much extra cost that we can pass downstream. But they were, folks were seeing positive drivers, evidence that the market may be starting to open and increased quote activity. So those are all comments that you all made. And so let's kind of start digging in, and let's kind of peel behind the curtain, if you will, and start digging into the data. And like we have here for the last year, you can't not talk about tariffs. The good news is, at least, the Supreme Court struck down the IEEPA tariffs, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, tariffs that were the wide-ranging ones that said, Brazil was at 50% and Indonesia was at 19%, and another country was at 15%, and there was kind of a patchwork quilt of levels. And at least from a stability standpoint, everyone's on an even playing field now. It's at least 10%, right? Kind of across the board. But again, it's disruption. And so things have changed from the status quo, and they're now at 10%. the good news is a lot of folks that may have left the U.S. market and the North American market are starting to look to come back, right? So the Brazilians, for example, had a 50% tariff that was unsustainable. The good news is they are preparing to come back to the States. But again, it's probably going to be May and June before product arrives to the port. And we'll talk about why that's important as you start looking out, especially at some of the grades like uncoated free sheet. So the good news is that tariffs, hopefully it looks like they've settled in at 10%. We'll see if anything else gets added, but at least the market can find some level of sanity, if you will, at a common tariff rate. And let's see if, how long those last. Again, they can only really last 150 days before Congress gets a say in the action. But there's still a lot of, higher level forces, geopolitical forces at the macro level. That's the conflict with Iran and Israel and the United States, which then affects the price of oil. And you can't have a conversation in business today without talking about oil. So let's talk about oil. And the reality is, given the circumstances, especially here over the last 24 hours, with the, strikes in Iranian oil fields and kind of what that did to uncertainty, and that all of a sudden, Brent crude, which is Brent crude futures to be exact, they're probably the best indicator of, what's going on with that marketplace with Iranian oil in the Straits of Hormuz. And so West Texas Intermediate at WTI that you'll hear a lot of folks reference, that's a byproduct that, its pricing moves up based on what, is going on globally as well. So you're seeing Brent crude at 113, and that number is extremely volatile. So I'd hate to even quote it right now, not knowing what's going on in the marketplace. And WTI is at 95, but you can see that's a dramatic uptick from what had been, fairly stable levels around $72 a barrel. And it's absolutely having an impact, right? This whole issue of the Straits of Hormuz, right? We're all really now in the know in terms of geography with regards to the Middle East and how wide this really strait is, and some of the interesting aspects of that kind of geopolitical landscape. And that's the reality. Is unfortunately there's a lot of tankers that are stuck on the other side of that strait. There's actually 2% of the world's container ships, believe it or not, are stuck, and they're isolated, and they're setting, basically at rest, unable to make this pass. And it's having, its effect obviously in the oil markets as well. And so you're really starting to see oil kind of jump up. And, oil is the main driver in terms of transportation cost movement that you're starting to see. Those of you that have, you don't have to be too much of a student of the industry to know what did you pay at the pump the last time you filled up, and how much of a dramatic move that was up. I just talked to someone earlier today and said, normally it's $38 to fill up in the car, and now it's over $60 to fill that same vehicle. Well, imagine if you're a tractor trailer and you're an over-the-road driver, imagine what that jump looks like. And you're really starting to see that also in container costs. Because remember, most of the world's cargo ships run on diesel fuel, right? And more importantly, not only on the fuel side of the equation, but oil and its derivatives, right? It's a feedstock for a lot of the products in the graphic art space, whether it's inks or coatings, resins, or even some of the substrates that, especially in the wide formats media space, are all derived in some way, shape, or form from petroleum. And the reality is, if these prices persist, right, because of this conflict, you're likely to see either product price increases and or fuel surcharges. And so, and the reason being is, China, India, South Korea, Japan, Europe, and the rest of Asia, they depend on oil that's derived, that comes specifically through the Straits of Hormuz, right? And so there is a huge dependency. Right now, it's 1 out of every 5 barrels that are consumed around the world come through that little strait. But more importantly, for those folks that are in Asia, it's the majority of their oil comes through that strait. And so that's why you're probably likely hearing, if you've got an Asian supplier in your supply chain, you may be hearing them rattle the sabers with regards to price increases and or fuel surcharges, just because oil at $72 a barrel is one thing. Oil at 100, 115 to 120. There's some poly market estimates that say it could go to 130. It really depends on how long this conflict persists, right? And we're seeing it, in domestic freight as well. You're really starting to see, that this is lagging data. So unfortunately, you don't really get a good sense of it because it may be a little aged, and a lot of this is transpired here really within the last week. But if I look at the truck lanes in the Midwest, it's $2.77 a mile, right? Well, that's up 51 cents just since November, and that's really even before this chaos of fuel has really taken off. And that number ticking up since November is actually very common. The Southeast is up by 45 cents. The Southwest 32, and really the markets that are kind of insulated a little bit is only, the West Coast is only at 9%. But pay attention, if you will, to these fuel prices down here, just in terms of, that instead of $3.72 a gallon for diesel, you're now well over $5 a gallon. In some markets, that number is closer to $5.50 a gallon. And this, fuel issue on top of really that the market was just starting to open up, right? When we talk about U.S. manufacturing, one of those proxies to understand is American manufacturing kicking in? Go look at the dry van capacity, shipment to load ratio. And so what is that? That means for every available tractor trailer dry van that's out there, how many loads does a driver have to sort through to say, I want to choose between this load or this load? Well, the reality is in February, that number was 9, right? And so that's a very high number. And you can see that it really started to spike in December. The number really started to pick up in December, and it's kind of maintained into January and into February. And so, again, that's an indicator that American manufacturing was on a rebound, right? Ahead of all this current chaos, American manufacturing was absolutely starting to improve, and it really started to show its way into the truckload rates. And so you can see that the rates were moving up as well, that both contract rates and spot rates were on the move up, right? And so now, it's uncertain in terms of how much those rates really start to go, as well as does it have any effect in terms of manufacturing. And you're seeing it spill over into ocean freight as well. And remember, I talked about the fact that, there's, container ships around the world, they move on diesel, right? And if, given where pricing is in diesel right now, container ship, fuel lines could, $35 billion of additional cost headwinds to operate the world's ocean fleet, given where fuel is right now compared to where it was at, say, $72 a barrel. And so I know I share with you where, ocean rates were. Throw them out the window, right? That $2,000 a container, throw it out the window, because you're going to see some numbers really start to spike here in the upcoming weeks. And it's because of not only the fuel piece in terms of what it costs diesel to operate the fleets, but because of the conflict in the Middle East, a lot of the vessels, they can't get insurance, right, to be anywhere in the Middle East. And so what you're seeing is normal vessel movements that would come through the Suez Canal. They're not going through the Suez Canal. They're going all the way down to the Cape of around Africa. And so that adds about 10 to 15 days around the southern tip of Africa. And so not only is it time, but that also means, that's time spent where they're not able to be sailing with another load. And so that's going to have an impact on ocean cargo rates as well. And so throw all the, where ocean freight rates have been, throw that out the window, because we haven't seen anything yet. And so this is one of the reasons why also You're hearing a lot of the Asian suppliers really start to speculate, hey, do I need to be putting a fuel surcharge? Do I need to be adding some kind of freight surcharge to my upcoming invoices, or do I need to just announce a price increase? Because these impacts are real and they are meaningful for these producers. Switch it over to something that at least is steady, and that's interest rates. And that the Federal Reserve met and had their press conference yesterday afternoon, and they held rates steady in between 3.5% and 3.75%, as inflation, at least on the PPI standpoint, is 2.4. The the PCE is at 2.9. And so again, it's one data point in terms of where inflation was and where interest rates were. But again, these Iranian conflict clouds loom, right? Be interested to know where this all moves to. From a consumer side, which really drives a lot of the GDP, really only starting to see, some of the electronics be lower in pricing, and you're really starting to see some of the other items, coffee and lettuce and beef and gas services, really starting to see inflation tick up there. In terms of, where's the dot plot? For those of you that like to track where the dot plot is and where will interest rates be, there's an expectation of at least one rate cut for this year. So the second rate cut that had been thought through is maybe being ruled out by a lot of folks, and that's caused Wall Street to really react in an erratic fashion. So if you're looking at your 401k or your stock holdings or whatnot, you're seeing that kind of wild speculation now that's been moving. The good news is, though, that the dot plot would say by 2027 there's another rate cut in there, and maybe does it hold steady? Again, these are all estimates, and the Iranian conflict, how long does it last? Obviously looms large in that piece as well. And you're really starting to see some of this uncertainty kind of carry over into the employment picture. That, this post that just came out in February that the U.S. economy actually lost 92,000 jobs was a little concerning, right? Most economists had expected a gain of about 55,000. And so to go backwards by 92 was a little alarming. And so you saw markets react a little bit to that as well. But remember that 4.1% is considered full employment. So we're only at 4.4. So I don't, lose too much sleep over that number. But I would also say that the unemployment rate really is determined on where do you live, right? Unemployment is really more of a neighborhood issue than it is a national issue. And you can really start to see that if you're in California, your unemployment rate is 5.5. If you're in the Midwest, like in the state of Indiana, it's 3.7. And so attracting talent in Indiana is very different, or that even of Alabama, than it is of California. And so you're really starting to see that market by market volatility, really play itself out. And so, Greg, why do you say that print was rebounding? And I look no further than the PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index, right? So this is an index that it gets ran every month, and it goes back, and it's got very strong correlation data, right? ISM, the Institute for Supply Chain Management, produces this survey. They do it every month, and it's been a great bellwether in terms of where U.S. manufacturing's at. And their February print came in at 52.4%, which was a great sign. That was 2 data points now finally above 50. 50 is considered the break-even point. Basically, it says more than half the respondents were looking forward in a positive manner. They were seeing manufacturing really start to pick up, right? What's more important, though, is that of the 12 manufacturing industries that were reporting growth, printing and related support activities was not just among the listed of growth, they were actually number 1. More people in the printing and related support activities pointed towards growth than any other industry. So that's why I believe, outside of this Iranian conflict situation, the industry was absolutely looking to see positive momentum. You were really starting to see some growth overall, but looking at new orders, again, printing and related support activities wasn't just among the 12 that reported growth, it was number one. Same way in production, right? And the same way in employment, really starting to see that uptick. And so that was great to see. And so as we were talking internally with our team at Millcraft, we were anticipating, hey, as we get through March, we should really start to see there's a tailwind at our back with regards to print. Now kind of everything maybe, a little bit of, uncertainty to say the least. And you could really also start to see that with the conference, board, right? So they put out, and it's again, a high correlation list. And when you're really starting to, you really want to see a number above zero. So this is the zero line right here, right? This guy right here. And so positives, yes, but really ultimately want to see it above zero, which we really haven't been since going back to kind of 2021 in that space. And if I look at, this is why, only the consumer, the American consumer, was the only thing that was pointing to negative in terms of the consumer expectation was negative. Everybody else, Wall Street and Main Street, were positive, which again points to what looked like recovery was on the horizon. But really, this concept of a K-shaped recovery, and I know we talked about this going back to 2024, that if recovery does come, it may be different. It's not like a tide that lifts all ships, right? That there are going to be some ships that lift higher, some ships that lift a little bit, and some ships that maybe don't get lifted at all. And it really talks about, a lot of times you'll hear K-shaped recovery, and people will talk about income inequality, right? I'm not necessarily talking about income inequality as much as I am talking about market segments or business segments that may get treated a little differently. And so what do I mean by that, right? So at the upper scale, right? If you're talking in your business services, folks in the healthcare or the pharmaceutical space, you're seeing really strong growth, right? For example, the new A1C pill, or the new pill from Pfizer, that is, the weight loss drug that they've gone from a shot or an injectable to a pill, man, that's big, going gangbusters in terms of the print that's associated with that space. Costco, I had someone, had a really interesting dialogue with someone talking about the difference between Costco and Target, and the fact that Target missed their quarter-over-quarter earnings, right? They actually showed their fourth quarter earnings were 1.5% below their year-over-year results, whereas Costco showed growth, actually significant growth, 9.2% growth year-over-year, quarter-over-quarter. And so what's the difference between Costco and Target? Well, think about the clientele, right? Think about the fact that Target is probably that value consumer, whereas Costco, for those of you that go to Costco, there may be this executive level card, right? And it's $100 a year to belong to this. But yes, you do get a rebate back depending on how much you spend. But it only accounts for 20% of all the memberships at Costco. But yet it accounts for more than 80% of their sales revenue. And so as you look at Costco is booming right now. And it's really driven by those folks in those kind of upper incomes. And again, just using this as that correlation between having a K-shaped recovery, talking about income inequality potentially, to talking about how that manifests itself in terms of manufacturing. And middle segments, retail display, election print, food packaging, the direct mail space is plugging along, right? And what's kind of maybe struggling is trans-promotional printing or statement printing. Those kinds of market segments are finding themselves being potentially replaced by substitution electronically or whatnot, or a lot of financial printing because of some of the new laws in terms of able to produce financial results electronically versus forcing them to be printed out. And so you're really starting to see this economy at various points in the scale, right? So, most economists would look at the industry or look at the economy and say, the U.S. economy is always going through expansion, peak, contraction, or recovery, right? This four-phased approach. And so where is everybody, right? So some, in the expansion mode right now, the software industry, semiconductors, pharmaceutical, healthcare. In the peak phase, right? AI-centric companies, aerospace, defense industries, kind of in the contraction phase, paper mills, petrochemical producers, and outperformers right now, in recovery mode. Only Japan and Eurozone right now are considered to be in the recovery phase. Well, where is American manufacturing? It's somewhere along that late cycle expansion phase, right? And so again, this was one of those reasons why we were optimistic, is really you could really start to see American manufacturing really start to kick in. Maybe it was because there was some clarity and certainty around tariffs, and it kind of all went haywire with the U.S. Supreme Court or whatnot. So whereas commercial print, it's in that late stage contraction, right? That's just the reality of where it's at. And it trails the U.S. economy right now by about 12 months. So the difference between where commercial print is in its cycle compared to where it needs to get up to where the U.S. overall economy is, U.S. Overall manufacturing is, it's about 12 months behind, right? Now that's before any extraordinary circumstances with regards to this most recent conflict, right? And so it'll be interesting to see how much of this uncertainty plays, havoc with this kind of recovery. Because as we all know, the commercial print space relies a lot on the Postal Service. And so hopefully you are all taking advantage of some of these postal promotions. I was ecstatic to see in my mailbox yesterday, Restoration Hardware sent out this massive catalog. I don't know if you can see that. Hopefully you can. This is a massive catalog. This thing maybe weighs about 2 pounds. It's got a soft touch on the front side and inside. It's beautiful. And it is a direct result of a promotion in terms of targeting catalog producers. And I've seen several of these, and hopefully you're starting to see these in your mailbox as well. And so I applaud those direct mail marketing companies, those catalogers, as well as those companies that produce catalogs. Take advantage of these promotions, right? This catalog promotion lasts until June of this year. And remember, the key is that the Postal Service is going to look what kind of response rate did they get? How many people actually participated in this promotion before they decide to do others? And so please, please, please take advantage and please support those folks that are investing in, catalogs, right? This is print, right? This is what we're all about as an industry. But speaking about the U.S. Postal Service, on Tuesday of this week, many of you may have been tracking that the United States Postmaster General, David Steiner, addressed Congress. And he talked about the fact that, the Postal Service is really on the verge of financial collapse. And his comments were that, in less than 12 months, unless Congress acts, right, the U.S. Postal Service will be without cash, right, to carry on. And that this issue is that even though the Postal Service receives no money, they receive no financial support from the U.S. government, they're still held, kind of oversight by Congress in terms of what they can and can't do. So they're actually treated worse than a monopoly, right? So they are supposed to be, quote unquote, the closest thing that the government has to a private business, but they constantly have to ask for permission for everything. Even though they're responsible for generating their own income. But the issue is that because of where they are, they've been losing money, right? So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out anytime you see your expenses above your revenue, you are losing money. And look how long the losing trend has been, right? You got to go back to 2022 when the U.S. Postal Service finally was the last time they really broke even. So they've been operating at a net loss. And all the Postmaster General was asking for is, can we please be able to borrow more than $15 billion? Because that's been mandated at that level since 1990. So again, we talk about some of the crazy things that are out there. That's one of them, that this limit was set in 1990 and hasn't been adjusted since. And so really there's a call to action here, I believe, whether that's you as an individual taxpayer or reach out to your member of Congress, and or as an industry, whether that's on the paper side, whether that's on the distributor side, whether that's Graphic Media Alliance, Printing Industries of America. We need to kind of align in terms of the Postal Service is extremely important to the print industry, right? Because the reality is, there's congressional oversight with no financial contributions. They really get more oversight than a monopoly. They have to operate. They're forced to operate 33,000 post offices, even though 58% of them don't cover their own costs, right? And it's because members of Congress don't want to see that little post office get shut down in their hometown, right? Even though it's losing money. And again, what business would be forced to operate something that's actually losing money? They're mandated 6-day-a-week delivery to 169 million mailboxes, even though 71% of the routes lose money. Imagine if they were able to reconstruct and say, how do we move to a 5-day schedule? Think about the overtime alone that they would save. They're mandated, they can't ship alcohol, right? And so think about what that means. That means think about how much business UPS and FedEx pick up because they have the ability and capability to ship alcohol, right? Depending on whether you're a teetotaler or not, but just being able to say, congressional controls of all the things that the Postal Service can and can't do is having an effect, right? And here's the reality, that the government, the Postal Service needs an infusion of cash, right? They need about $20 billion in capital improvements, right? And most third-party estimates would say, that they really need somewhere between 30 and $40 billion of credit access. And it's not like they're going out to the banks, right? They're going to issue treasuries, right? And so it's kind of crazy. But at the end of the day, why does this matter, Greg? Why does this matter, right? I see that the first class mail has dropped 56% since 2027, right? But why does this matter? And it's because 25 to 30% of all that we do in the commercial print space ends up in the postal system in one way, shape, or form. So to a degree, a lot of the things that we all do and produce end up in the mail stream. We have to have a financially viable postal service. Let's not allow ourselves to get to the point where we're Canada Post and all of a sudden they make draconian cuts to the point where postal inquiries, direct mail is greatly curtailed in Canada. And so that's your call to action. All right, let's talk about the printer market. All right. Again, things were looking up. January shipments came in at 7.36 billion. It was its best month since August, right? Which is phenomenal. It was 0.7% up over the fourth quarter average. There's a really great piece out there if you're not reading a lot of the stuff from Printing United, the Printing United Alliance Insights. They do a really great piece, and they just released their fourth quarter commercial printing report for the fall of the fourth quarter, and talking about operational costs are absolutely higher, and unfortunately, their profitability is lower as a result of some of the things that have been going on with regards to tariffs and or price increases. And that, unfortunately, a lot of these folks have been unable to pass along price increases to their customers, right? And so that it's having, it's cutting their margins and, access to certain supply chains. And that, while some of them have raised prices, 76% of the respondents talked about they absorbed some level of price increase along the way. And so that's absolutely painful. As folks looking forward, 30% of the respondents said that they were looking forward to 2026 being better, 24% saying worse, but 35% saying there was still way too much uncertainty hanging out there. And so again, the printer space is kind of, anticipation in terms of, man, if things could just get some level of certainty, I think the print community is turning around. So let's talk about on the paper supply side, right? And so again, I always like to keep grounded, folks, because sometimes I don't know, how much folks understand or not in terms of some of the terms that I use. So the difference between uncoated free sheet, uncoated groundwood, coated free sheet, and coated groundwood, simply, if it says free sheet, that means lignin has been removed from the product. What is lignin? That's the stuff that makes your newspaper turn yellow. So when you hear free sheet, that's what I'm talking about. Grades that have had the lignin removed. And then you're going to hear me talk about coated versus uncoated. That just means, one's got an uncoated surface, one's got a kind of a combination of clay and latex and some other kinds of ingredients that really make it kind of shiny. And I would be doing a disservice. I didn't talk about the fact that you can have SCA, you can have some uncoated groundwood that can be calendared to the point where they actually get a glossy surface. Again, like to make sure that everybody's grounded so that when we talk about these next slides, they get an understanding and a sense, for what markets we're talking about, what grades we're talking about. So if I look at the apparent demand, apparent consumption of these grades, right? Here's the reality. Uncoated free sheet is the biggest market that's out there. And we've come from, 2022, the market was about 6.8 million tons. It's hanging around about a 5 million ton market right now. January's number came in very low. And that was really surprising. Why was it surprising? Because there was a price increase that is in the market that was going through. And normally, you would see a lot of pre-buy activity. That did not happen in January. So that was a little, surprising to say the least. If I look at the coated free sheet market, it's been fairly stable. If I go look at 2.2, 1.9, 1.88, yes, you could say that was a kind of a blip down. But these three markets, the coated free sheet, the coated mechanical, and the uncoated uncoated groundwood, have been fairly stable. Yes, there's been a little bit of a blip here in coated mechanical, but you're going to start to see that pick up. That market picks up because of some operational issues with one coated free sheet mill that will probably cause some escalation. The reality is that imports, because of the tariffs, they've really struggled, right? Notice that Brazil or South America really leaves this chart. That's that purple space right here. And that was because of that 50% tariff. Now that it's been removed, it'll be anxious to see come May, come June especially. More than likely, it's going to be June before we see this number really start to be affected. And you can see that, imports, again, now that the tariffs are all at 10%, we'll be anxious to see what that does on the import side. Because on the uncoated free sheet side, we talked about this, that 20% of the capacity of that market's gone. And why is that? We talked about this the last time we were together. There have been so many mills taken out between Georgetown, Pixel taking out Chillicothe, and IP taking out Riverdale, as well as, even Silvamo's Eastover mill being prepped for its big outage that's coming up here in the late third quarter of this year, and the fact that they would need to take some time to build inventory. And so you're really starting to see market tightness, right? And you've seen it, right? We've seen allocation get announced in the marketplace, and we'll talk about that here in a second. And the reality is that inventories actually improved, which was a good thing to see, as we closed out. So remember, this is December data, right? So this is December data. And it would say that, 44 days of inventory on hand, 34 days inventory on hand, and uncoated free sheet. Where are operating rates? Well, operating rates, anytime you see them in the red, that's above 90%. That means that's an extremely tight market. That means when you're going to see, fits of allocation, and that's exactly what you're seeing right now. You're seeing most domestic suppliers of uncoated free sheet, they're on allocation. And now you're even seeing one mill on the coated free sheet side. So Sappi Cloquet has had a string of operational issues. And so they just announced here over the last, call it 48 hours, that they're going on allocation just to protect their customers' supply chains with Cloquet. And so this is why I believe you're going to see a little tightness in terms of maybe some folks grading from coated free sheet because they're struggling to get it, and they may move into coated mechanical, or obviously there may be other suppliers that pick up that volume, whether they're imports or Billerud, domestically. And so again, I expect, that, uncoated free sheet is going to continue to be tight, that, at least until May, and it'll be anxious to see, when the Brazilians can actually get back into the marketplace. And then more importantly, what is happening with demand? Because again, this tightness only occurs at a given level of demand. If demand continues on its pace, uncoated free sheet market's going to be tight probably until the end of the Iranian conflict. All of a sudden, demand falls off. The market could loosen, and by the summertime, these allocations may be off, right? So there's still a lot of uncertainty out there, and that's really the kind of the tail of the tape as you look at. Okay, so where are we at? The markets are always about supply and demand. They always are, right? So where are things at, right? There are so many things on either the demand side or the supply side that would really say it's all about uncertainty at this point, right? If you were to ask me 3 weeks ago, I could have given you a completely different read here than where we sit today. And that's really because of, this Iranian conflict. How long does it last? How deep does it go? And knowing that, again, I'm not trying to be red. I'm not trying to be blue. I'm trying to be black and white. This is having a real effect, both on the demand side as well as costs over on the supply side. All right, so what should you do? Right, I've heard a lot, Greg. Tell me, what should I do, right? A reminder, I want you to advocate. Be a student of this industry. Be a supporter of this industry. Contact your member of Congress. Contact your industry association and talk about how, as an industry association, we can stand alongside the Postal Service. Again, no one wants to see postal rates go up, right? We know what that does to demand, but at some point, they've got to be able to operate, right? At some point, they got to be able to put back and invest. And how do we put some reasonable changes in play here that would say at some point, there's the adults have got to come to the table. All right, let's talk about partners, right? We truly believe our job, at least as Millcraft, is to protect customer supply chain. And I know that all distributors believe that, right? Now is the time to absolutely partner, right? There's going to be a lot of uncertainty out there, and that supply chains absolutely do matter, right? Are you looking at a supply agreement that's going to protect your interest, that's going to make sure you have allocation support, and get out of this transaction-only mindset, right? That as I get a job, I'll quote it, right? That's a recipe for disaster, especially on the uncoated free sheet side right now, because the market is in allocation. And this requires, collaboration, right? You got to be willing to share your cards with your partners, right? And I want you to think deeper and longer term, right? There's a lot of moving parts here, man. This is not a simple industry, right? There's not two things that are going on here. There are a myriad of things that are going on all the time. I mean, go back and watch some of these state of the industry that we've done all the way back to 2017. Man, there's always something going on. And man, this is why it's important to be, partnered with folks. And that really you need to decomplexify where you can your supply chain and, look to get visibility for yourself as well as your suppliers so that you can absolutely make the best choices possible. There's always wild cards out there, right? So what are the wild cards? This conflict, how long does it last? How deep does it go? How involved does it get, right? Would love to think that this thing wraps up in a month. I'm not sure that's possible. I'm not sure that's realistic, but that's what we can hope for, right? The president, think about between tariffs, there's things on the positive and there are things on the negative. Again, my job is not to be red or blue, it's to be black and white. You can't deny the fact that a lot of the things that he's done has had a lot of input into where we find ourselves. The Postal Service in Congress, right? That's a big one. That's a big wild card that's out there, because if the Postal Service goes into a financial difficulties and has to shut down for any period of time, again, 25 to 30% of what we all touch and produce goes through the mail stream. That's a huge wild card. And interest rates, right? We all know that every time there's an interest rate adjustment, it's good for print, more importantly, it helps get, consumers maybe off the sideline and helps with marketing, right? Marketing spend. Marketing spend is always good for the print industry. All right, so what is Millcraft doing specifically, right? We spent a lot of time. We spent about 45 slides talking about overarching things and one slide about Millcraft. And I'm not doing my job if I'm not selling Millcraft to all of you in some way, shape, or form. Our job is to protect our customer supply chain. And how are we doing that? We put $10 million in technology to make sure that we provide our customers with the visibility they need. But more importantly, we also align with global partners that are sustainable, dependable, and reliable, right? And again, given the backdrop of all this uncertainty, you want to be with people that have some level of certainty. And so we built a variety of durable supply chains. There's a lot of disruption in the carbonless form space. Would love for you to talk to your Millcraft representative in terms of what we're doing to protect customers in that space. And just as a aside, if anyone wants to have a conversation about potential disruptions in the carbonless market, I'm always open for conversation because there's another giant shoe to drop here in the next month in that space. And that we generally try to be forward thinking as well. All right, so summary, right? Just when you think you were set for success, more March Madness arrives, right? The Iranian conflict there's still a lot more to play out, right? In the short term, we could see fuel surcharges. I know there are suppliers that are contemplating rolling out a fuel surcharge here in the short term, right? Because they can't absorb some of the freight rates they're going to see here over the next week or so. And it may also manifest itself in product price increases. Why? Because oil affects a lot of the feedstocks that go into chemicals for coatings and or substrates. And so you can't have oil go from $72 a barrel to $110 a barrel and folks not feel it in some way, shape, or form. Eventually, you're going to feel that kind of shock. Honestly, do believe supply chains matter, right? That you need to be partnered with folks that can help give you access to the best suppliers, whether they're domestic or global in some way, shape, or form. They're going to be still can be considerable constraints in the uncoated free sheet market. It's going to be tight. Again, especially if demand continues at the level that it's at. Domestically, it's going to be tight in coated free sheet as well because of the sappy cloquet operational issues. And it'll probably be June or July before those things get stabilized. And, really it's about partnership transparency, making sure that, you're set up for success when that you've got partners at your back that you can depend on, right? And then hopefully, if nothing else, that Millcraft remains committed to providing world-class supply chain strategies to really help our partners actually thrive in a period of chaos. All right. You've heard from me. Now it's your turn. What questions do you all have?
Looks like we have a question that just came up from David. Says comments on the synthetic substrate markets.
So it's a great question, especially given the fact that those synthetic substrates are all petroleum derived, and it depends on does oil hit $120 a barrel, and then what part of the world is that substrate being produced? So if that substrate's being produced in Asia, you're not only going to have the cost of the petroleum to create that substrate, you're also going to have the cost to transport that. Indonesia, China, those countries are all dependent. Japan, they're all dependent on oil that comes through that strait, right? That's real. That's not hyperbole. That's just math. And so if things remain as they are, you're going to see substantial impacts, right? Whether they are short-term surcharges, whether they are folks say, hey, I'm not going to produce because I don't want to do anything crazy with pricing, not knowing where the long-term this all kind of plays out at. And so I know I'm not giving you an exact answer, but yeah, you're going to see, you will absolutely see that the especially the poly substrates really get affected here. And it may take, 60 to 90 days for that to fully hit based on where things are in manufacturing, how much work in process inventory, how much finished good inventory, and the time it takes for, some of these items to get on the water.
Awesome. Thanks, Greg. And thanks, David, for that question. We do have another question that came in from Anthony. He is asking, how will the election season shape printing, especially paper of board, 9, 10, 12 point for a print campaign? How strong in terms of number % growth?
So it's a good question, Anthony. Folks are already starting to see that in the 9-point coded reply card. I've heard reports of 15 to 20% growth in those grade lines. And remember that, the midterm elections don't happen until November. And a lot of the primaries, especially the heated primaries, really don't hit until May. So we're still in the very, very early stages of, some of this midterm election political mail really starting to kick in. So, I would expect to see a significant lift in that space, specifically in the 9-point coded reply card space.
Awesome. Thanks, Anthony, for that question. And thank you, Greg. Any other questions right now? And while you guys are thinking of your questions, just something I want to mention. On the screen, you can see this email address, industryupdates@millcraft.com. That I just want to make sure that everyone knows that we are monitoring that. And if you have questions anytime, you can also send them to that email address and we will get back to you. It also helps inform us for future industry updates, so that we're making sure that we're speaking to the topics that you guys want to hear about. So remember that email address, industryupdates@millcraft.com. And then in the meantime, if we have other questions right now, of course, Greg is ready and willing to answer them.
All right. Again, we hope that you find this time useful and helpful. Again, this is our opportunity to give back to you all, to help make you smarter, to hopefully set you up for success, and really try to partner with folks in the industry. Again, please use that industry updates at millcraft.com to let's continue the dialogue. Let's continue the discussion. You want to know more about EPR? Again, I talked about the fact that there was a lot of things that we didn't get a chance to talk about. EPR is one of those that, man, we can go for an hour all by ourselves on that one. Carbonless market, that's a whole big one in and of itself as well. Happy to have a conversation with people on a one-off basis, because again, I think that industry has the potential to get turned on its ear here in the next, call it 40 days, pending some litigation that's working its way through the justice system.
All right. Well, thanks, Greg. Appreciate all the information you had to share today. Thank you all for joining us today. We know you have a choice of where you spend your time. We appreciate you choosing to spend it with us. We wish you all a great rest of the week, and we hope you enjoy the weekend when it comes up. And don't forget to email us at industryupdates@millcraft.com.
See you all.